Welcome back to another episode of our Mega-lo-Mania rewrite in Unreal Engine. So yesterday I continued a little bit after I ended the stream into the evening, and I cut out effectively all of the technology images, and as you can see, some of them have multiple varieties. Some of the higher level ones, the ones that you manufacture, actually appear 4 times within the sprite. So we have one for the blueprint that's used on the research screen and the blueprint screen. We have one for the information, which is shown if you display the army people on a particular sector, for want of a better description. One for the manufacturing and one for the offensive screen. And the little gold, kind of yellowy gold icon at the top right for a number of them shows basically how many people that particular weapon takes. So I think the cannon and the jet take 3, catapult, biplane take 2, most of the rest take just 1. And then alongside that, I removed the old technology technology data table, and I also completed, again by applying all the graphics to all the columns here. So a lot of repetition and particularly uninteresting work, but the end result meant that if we play and go to the research screen, we can see some research. Now the research listed here is just what it finds in the order that it finds it. There's no restrictions on what can be shown or what should be shown. It's just showing them all. But obviously you can select them, you can do what you would expect to do from them. Now that seems to have gone off center, but never mind. So last time we finished off the resources, really just kind of getting the basics there, not really any of the interaction, and all the other screens pretty much remain as they were. So I think the next step is a bit of an awkward one, because a lot of the game systems that are in place now are kind of, I've tied up the research, as we know, with the player controller, and it's not necessarily, well, it's not correct to be tied up to the player controller, because the player can own many different sectors, and the way this particular game works is every sector is independent. You don't have a global resource pool or anything like that. Each sector is independent in terms of population, technologies that are available. Its epoch level is completely separate from the rest, how many people are there, and basically everything. They're just completely separate areas. Now you can transfer people from one area to another, so you can take all your pikemen from one sector and put them into a sector that currently can't create pikemen, or perhaps never would be able to create pikemen, depending on the resources and technologies that can be unlocked. But the sector is where it all is. It's all ran by that. Now, we currently have a sector blueprint, which is being represented by this sprite, and I'm not sure that that's where we really want to put the game logic, because obviously this blueprint that's going to control the sector as a whole really doesn't want to be concerned with how to render a map place. So we need to kind of tie everything up to this sector, and instead of the player controller, and then run every kind of interaction the user does through that sector. And I don't think there's really anything more I can do without that, because I could obviously allow it so you could allocate, deallocate people to the resources, but they would in theory come from the sector or the player controller as it's tied up now. So the code would be the same as how we allocate and deallocate to the research. A lot of the research doesn't actually have any time. But to actually be able to populate, for example, the blueprints or properly populate the shields, defense or offense, we need the research to be able to unlock. And to unlock the research, we actually need the sector to control that. So I'm going to try and make a start on that kind of aspect of the game. Now I don't think there's any particular blueprint style, so blueprint base class, that's going to help here. We just want some kind of controller to deal with this, and I think just a base blueprint would work. Because as I say, we don't want really the blueprint to be in charge of rendering anything either. So the sector is here, and that's the sector blueprint. So the sprite that actually uses is called the slab. So I'm going to rename the sector blueprint to slab, which isn't a particularly nice name, but any way to refresh it up here? Is it going to be forever called sector? Oops. Because we're going to want to have the sector defined at this level. Just seeing if there's a particular base class that sounds like it would be more useful than just a normal one. I don't think there really is. So we can just pick the object, not an actor. I mean, it could be an actor. In the grand scheme of things, it probably wouldn't make a great deal of difference. But an actor does have a number of bits of functionality that aren't going to be relevant to our sector. Now we've created, I suppose one of the things that would be possible. Let's see if this works. So we've created our, I'll call that our sector, and that disappeared. Oh, it's there again. So we've got our sector. It says its parent class is actor, so maybe they're all actors anyway. Oh, okay, that parent class is blueprint. So that sector's obviously seemed to have perhaps inherited something from the previous sector that we had. So let's just get rid of that one. We'll rename it a bit later. Yeah, so we can have a standard blueprint without any kind of components, without anything really. Just wondering, because an actor can have components and you can then create actor components, and that would be kind of a reasonably good way to build some hierarchy into the logic, but I'm not sure that there's going to be any benefit there, because then you've basically got to deal with the interaction between those blueprints and stuff. So we're going to call this our sector controller. Now the sector's got to have some basic information, and that kind of comes down to two key things: the island name that we've already got anyway. If you don't press enter there, it doesn't change its name, and once you highlight off it, it still is the old name. So we'll make the island name exposed on spawn and editable. So one thing about the island is that, oh, sorry, the sector is we probably want it to replicate in multiplayer. But we'll deal with the multiplayer side of things a bit later on. So for now, I'm just going to leave everything as they were. So I'm going to have a nice generically named data structure, which is our sector structure that we've created before. And that again is instance editable and exposed on spawn. So when we create one of these sectors, this is the information that we're going to be given. Now, some of this information is not necessary for the sector itself, but it needs to know how to find it, because it needs to know effectively how to pass that on to other places. The key information for a sector would be for what island and what location, which is available within the dataset. I suppose actually they both go. Maybe we don't need that one then, because the data has both island name and location, so we should be okay with that. So when the level is loaded, the user is going to have picked a space in the previous level, effectively the menu that starts the level. They're going to pick a location, and that's, aside from the island name and the location, that's pretty much where we're going to start. So that probably is what actually we want to create here. I mean, a lot of this information is actually only relevant to well, the sector location is relevant to the slab itself. The resources are relevant to the sector as a whole, so it's kind of like half and half. Half the information is useful to it and half isn't. I guess another thing that we know that we kind of get given to start with is the population. Not sure why they have. Well, I suppose something being instance editable may not be exposed on spawn, but the other way around doesn't work. Okay, so we have initial population, or basically the population, and then we have the data. So when this map gets started, event begin play, we want to set up the camera. And at the moment we just have this iterate map spaghetti graph, and then we have our render current island. So all of that is probably not really relevant moving forward. We want to blueprint. So how do we create a new instance of one of those? That's the question. Did not look this up. Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of stuff on what you can do with one, but there's nothing about how you can create one. Always get stuck at the first hurdle. Bunch of casting. But we are looking for, well, construct object from class. That looks about right. There we go. It's just finding the right terminology that they've decided to use for a particular call. So there we go. So we're not going to do any of that. Render current island. That creates the panel and everything. Probably need to do that at some point, actually. Actually, we've got here, in there we actually get the data table row, so maybe we'll leave this one as it was. Render current island is just an event because I wanted the begin play to be clean and straightforward. So we come over here to render the current island from an event. We get given our effectively our island name when this level is spawned. We're also going to be given our is this actually a function? No, this was a different graph, wasn't it? Yeah. So that's kind of debug stuff. We'll call it debug island index. Our island names, again, is used within this context. Oh, actually, they're not used at all, so goodbye, island names. Our island is used over here, so we set that on the level. I don't think we actually want to because... Oh no, that's the island information, isn't it? So the island information is display name, starting tech level, starting epoch, the biome and the opponents. So yeah, we want to kind of keep the island on the level area. All the sectors, they're passed straight into the panel. It needs all the sectors to be able to create the appropriate minimap. So I think that's okay too. Current menu, I don't think that's used anymore. Not at the level anyway. Right, okay, so it is in change menu, but that's almost certainly going to come out of here. No, that's not even used anymore, is it? Because it's all handled by the switcher now, so... I don't think we need this. Is there any way to verify that? It would be good if I can verify it, but since none of the screens are, well, a few of the screens are tied up, I'm going to go for I don't use it anymore. So we don't need the current menu. So we start with the island name, and we're going to also start with the population, because again that's basically what our sector controller needs. Put them at the top, and the sectors and the island, neither of them are editable by the instance, which makes perfect sense. So we're basically looking for the island in the data table, and we're setting it locally so we've got a reference to it, and then we're passing in there. I can't think of any other scenario where the game will need the island to be able to create opponent stuff, but I don't think it actually needs to store it. So I'm just going to get rid of that too. I think it needs to use it, but it doesn't need to keep it. Just trying to make sure that it's kind of really just got and using what it needs to have. So we set the island sectors and pass them in. Yeah, see, again, I'm not sure that this needs to store the sectors, so I'm gonna say that there's a, what do we do here? Clear it, add one each time we've found one. Yep. So I'm going to create a local variable. Ooh, sticky key there, which would be our sector array. Output will be that, and rather than adding them to that one, we'll add them to the local one, and we don't need to clear it because we're only going to ever start with an empty set, an empty array. That back. Right. I can delete that now. Rename that. Still can't rename that. Compile. Now we can rename that. Nope. I'll save. Can I rename it now? Maybe it's on the return node. It's probably better. For the return value to be sectors, and this can just be now it can't be island sectors either. There we go. Because within this scope, it doesn't really matter what that variable is called. What's nicer is it to be cleaner from here, which then we can tie up those two. So we kind of reduced a few of the member variables for our main game class. Make sure keeping it light. Once we've created, let's call that get now. Once we've got our island sectors, we create the panel. I suppose just before that, really. That's where we want to do the create object from class. Or what was it called? Construct object from class, that's the one. So our class will be our sector controller. Owner of the constructor class. Self? No? So I think that ties the life of the sector to this. Oh, actually we need more than one, don't we? We need one for every map sector. Yes. So at the moment we're going to for iterate over each of the items. We don't know which one the player's chosen at this point. So we're going to have a new variable to handle that. Again, the previous level is actually going to tell us where all of the players are going to start, not just the player, but every opponent player, whether it local or remote, that kind of thing. So player start locations is more correct, and it's an array of integers. So that array of integers and the length of should be the same as our so break it. the same as our length of opponents here. We're not going to do anything with that yet, but that's a check that we'll have to do. So we create a new sector controller for each of the sectors. Yeah, so the player start location is going to tell us where each of the players are starting. We're also going to need, alongside that, the population they're starting with. We'll worry about that part later. I think we need to kind of do the pre-screen and figure out what kind of information we're passing through. Because I think that perhaps the structure is going to be better then. Because it's basically what colour are they, how many people they're starting with, and where they're starting that we need to know, not just an array of player start locations or population. So we won't worry about that right now. So we create one of these sector controllers. Now the sector controller holds the data for the sector, which is what we're using in the create panel. We're actually we need to pass all of the sectors to the panel because the panel stores the minimap. Now so if the minimap was just there to show the map and to change the view, then it wouldn't really need a great deal much else, but the minimap actually needs to show armies on each different place, and the minimap switches between the map and some information about every unit that's on that particular sector. So it needs to know everything. So I think the key thing would be that we're actually going to need, rather than passing the sectors into the panel, we're going to have to pass in so it needs all of them for the minimap. It would be better if the game held them, which is the game's got them. Yeah, I'm thinking that I don't even know if it will run yet. Yeah, so the minimap section, even next to the shield says how many units are in this sector for that particular player, which could obviously be many different armies. Well, at least one at most even one army for each team. But the minimap needs all of the sectors to render. But it only needs them once. Once it's rendered the map, that's fine. And then it's just returning the location index later on. And that information, aside from the island name, the sector epoch is purely from the sector. All of the information that's populated through these screens, as we called them, the menu screens, that's all populated from the sector as well. So we only need the sectors within the panel to render the map. So there may be some changes that we can do to kind of clean that up. But for now, we know that see if we can do this. Reference. And add. So we just want to build up that array of sector controllers for our particular map. Once that's done, we can create the panel widget, but we're going to pass in the sectors over here instead, because we don't want to pass in just the raw data, we want to pass in our new controller classes. So we need to change this from being, at the moment it's a list of sectors. Luckily we only use it once when we're creating the map widget, so we pass that straight in. That's pretty much what we want though. We don't want to we don't want to be using the sectors throughout the entire control panel. I'm just trying to find now where. So the island name gets passed in from the constructor, and the island name is not used. Does the island get passed in? Yeah, the island gets passed in. So the island needs to go in because so that's going to need to be a bit more than that, isn't it? Later on. At the moment we're just using that to get the display name of the island. I don't think we use that for anything else. Yeah, we just use it here to basically set the display name and get the biome. Okay, that's fine. So some of the information that's coming into the panel is really only just being used for a minimal amount of stuff. So I think that we're going to leave that as it is. The panel's going to, when the user selects a sector, we're going to create this event, and we create this event actually on the map, and that does the selection. But what we really want is something to happen further up than that. Because everything that the panel does, it happens on render, but that's not going to be true. It's not going to do all of this when it renders. Quick map widget. Yeah, so I'm not sure whether it would actually re-render the panel entirely when you change the sector, or whether it would just change the data. I mean, obviously it could re-render the panel entirely. So it creates the opponents. Kind of, there's so many pieces to kind of tie together. I'm not 100% sure how each piece should be tied together. So we've got obviously certain parts of the game functioning, or a small part of the game functioning, and it's now trying to get the controller in place so it can control this, the sector controller, be in charge of population allocation, things like that. The way that the player controls which sector they're looking at is only through the map. Now, if we say that index, if we say that the panel is constructed with a location. Then in the game, get that value exposed. So editor, expose on spawn. Yeah, so once we've created all of the sector controllers, we create our panel, and our panel should, see, that's the difference. If we're going to re-render or recreate the panel entirely every time we change sector, which sounds better, because if we don't, then we risk leaving something around in the old instance of it. We could reset most of it and kind of leave bits and pieces. So if we recreate it, then we know that that panel is completely fresh. So what we'll do is we'll go with that. So when the panel is created, we have a location. So we bind to the event, we add it to the horizontal bar, add the map widget to it. So if we call sector selected and give it our location, and call it on the right widget. See what that does. Nothing. So we've got some errors. What errors do we have? So maybe we can't call that until after we've added it. Does make some sense. Yeah, not great. So we need to get the first location. So we don't really care where the location is to start with. So we can use that. Get a reference to 0. And pass its location in. That should mean that our first sector is selected, yes. Yeah, I'm just thinking that the panel may be just too much of a single widget, rather than having all of that whole left hand side controlled by one thing. Because the minimap and the opponents, as I've said, that requires the rest of the information. It requires all of the players to do the shields. It requires all of the sectors to do the map. Whereas the bottom panel, it doesn't actually require any of that information because it only represents this single sector. I could still keep the panel and just have the map created externally. At the game level instead. Because the reason, once I've created the minimap, I want to select the location, and by selecting the location I want the bottom panel part to render, the screens as I've called them. Having them all kind of create at the same time couples things together in a way that I don't really need nor want. But we need the sector data to render the slab. It's just whether it's under the game is the next highest, kind of the bit that's above everything in terms of what we see in the play area. So it would make sense that the game is controlling all of these three components effectively, the menus or the screens, the minimap and the opponents and the slab, or the minimap and the components considering them as one, potentially. So rather than having this panel that pieces everything together, which is really just a vertical box with a couple of containers anyway. That container is a horizontal box and then a screen switcher. So the screen switcher makes some sense as kind of the primary container of the menu. Okay, let's try that. So within our screens, we're going to create our screen switcher. And the screen switcher call it the screen switcher. It's going to have all of that. Ooh. Not entirely because I missed a bit, but that might upset it. No. Okay, so that's one. And, oh, I did undo it and put it back. It's probably best to copy it anyway. Well, did not mean to put them in there. There we go. So root, blueprint, defense, shield, defense, and attack. Which we don't have. Research and resource, just so there's a reasonable order to that. So yeah, we can see all the research, all the resources there, not in any order, but they're all there at least. Sorry, all the researchers. So the screen switcher is separate out of the panel. Probably got really confused because I cut things out, but we're going to fix the panel up anyway. So let's break that. It's basically old stuff. So the map container contains the minimap and the opponents, and both the minimap and the opponents are going to need different sets of data, but they also do need references to the sector that we're working on. Yeah, so the sector has a location, so the sector may be able to drive it. Okay, so also we need, we're going to call it the route layout, but actually we just call it the layout. And the panel is a canvas panel with a vertical box in it, and the vertical box has got a specific size and anchor, so the layout's just going to be effectively that. 85 and 200. Anchor to the top right. We'll just call that container. Yep, okay. So in our game, once we've finished creating our sector controllers, we'll create our widget. And this widget, it's not going to be a panel, it's going to be our layout. Is that true? Is true, but where's our layout gone? Within our layout, we want to add the horizontal bar, and we'll call that the map container. I think that's what we called it in the panel. Yep. And again, that's going to be a variable. So we'll just have a look at our panel. Map container was to the right and full, so we'll do that with this one, right and full. So when our game creates our container, our game also wants to create you want to create it first? We also want to create our map. I think we might as well add it to the viewport straight away. So we want to create our map, and we know what our biome is, and we also know what the sectors are. So that will render the map, and now we actually want to this one. Nope. Get map container and add child to horizontal box. Let's see if that works. Yep, good. So we've got a compile error because some of the blueprints aren't tied up correctly, but our minimap renders okay. somewhere. Yeah, it was in the panel actually. So in the panel we actually called the selected sector on the minimap. And now we've done that, we're going to do that again here. Now the select sector index would be the location the player has started. Again, we'll just use our whichever is the first sector pin, just so that we're starting with a sector. Why did that not work? 0 location. Let's take that out. So we call sector selected on the map. Oh, highlight sector. Is that what we wanted instead? No, highlight sector is a function. Selected, location, target, it's a map. It might be because we did that. So we don't actually want to do that in this context. So it's rather than calling the sector selected, we just want to call the, can we call the, oh, not on there, the highlight sector call instead. So we don't want to trigger that event, because that event only should occur when the user changes the location. What we want to do is tell it, just highlight this one, because that's where we are. So I'd say that would be the one that the user has selected to start on. Actually, I think we do want the event. Show bind. Keep doing that. Take it from the white. It doesn't work. So we do want to bind to that. And I think we do want to trigger it. So a bit of a reverse there, but we want to do that because that's going to set up everything else. Before we bound that straight to the event of this widget, like this, the highlight sector, and that basically meant that it highlights a sector. What we actually want to do is do everything else once we've set that selector. So we want to bind that to our own event on this map, so even on this graph. And the current island. Yeah, so I just wanted to keep that kind of debug iteration stuff out of the way. I just don't think that that's making any sense. So we're gonna take that out. Just tie them up. So probably going to actually keep that in this graph at the moment. We can always put it into a separate graph later on. So at the moment we're just showing, not showing anything. What have we gone wrong? Ah, yeah, that's why I did it as an event. So I just want to keep that placeholder without having that error. So I might come back to kind of fixing that up to work a bit better moving forwards, but for now, back to the game. So effectively, this event here is going to fire every time the user changes the sector. We know that the first thing that we're going to want to do is set the selected thing, because the minimap doesn't do it, because the map's used for in other contexts. So we want to call the highlight selector manually. Let's see if this works. That value. Yeah. So everything works in that case. Now, we could render the opponents, the shields down the right hand side immediately, but the opponents do take information about the sector, predominantly the amount of units within that. So what we're going to do is render the components here, sorry, the opponents. And we know so I'm gonna add a comment, I think, to this one. Use the first sector as the this keeps that clean. So we know the amount of opponents here. So when we construct our opponents widget, which is this one, we know that we want to know how many and what colour the opponents are. We'll just stick with how many, and we'll just use the colours that they are in the order that they're in. Int count, and that will be an integer, and we set it when we spawn it. So over the game, we'll set the opponents to that. And now we can say, in this code, we add all the shields to an array and we set that. And all of those are currently images that are displayed by default. So what we'll actually do is, we know the first one is, well, there's always going to be at least two. So we'll only hide the bottom two. And play that. Okay, we forgot to add it, so we'll do that just so we can visually see this work. So once we've got that, we want to add it to the horizontal bar for part of the map widget, which is the map container. So for that widget, we will add child. No, can't do it from there. Do it from here. Add child horizontal bar. So we'll add it to the horizontal bar. Same one as we've added the map to. So that should show it now. Yep. So again, we've got minimum of 2 because there's always going to be at least 2 valid players. But we've given it the opponent count. So now, when it's constructed, it sets the shield array, and it just does that so it's got them all. So it will need them eventually. It's going to add, we're going to add the text alongside it in here, but for now we'll get the opponent count. Use a for loop. So we would potentially have to check that the opponent count is less than the array. We do want to take one away from it though, because opponent count is going to be like 2 player, 3 player, 4 player, and our array of shields is actually 0 to 3. So we just need to take that one off to make sure that we're using the right value in this context. So we will do that. And I really want to get a copy. They're probably references anyway, that have to be references. And we'll set the visibility to visible. So in this map we only have 2 opponents. So hopefully if we go back to our data, islands, we have 3 opponents on Pajama. And set our island name accordingly. Yep, so we have 3. Not great, because I didn't put them in the right order. 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we just switch those around. Could have just switched them around in the array, obviously. Oh well, that works. Would work. So now we just get the first 3, or we'd get the 0, 1, 2, 3. Ah, okay, so yeah, I don't need to -1. I've actually, in the island data, I actually say how many opponents there are rather than how many players. I think actually I'll change that. I think saying how many opponents there are is a bit weird. Saying how many players there are is a bit better. So I'll just always update the spreadsheet first so that it's all in sync. So I'll just make sure the spreadsheet is up to date. Download our CVS. So now we've updated the data. some point, and we'll notice we'll update to re-import it, and now when we play we should still get our 4 shields. So that's, we've now changed it so that our island show how many players there are, not opponents. I did forget to change the heading, so we'll change that. Export the data again. Doesn't look like there's an easy way to get to the structure that this data table represents. Would be nice to have a link between the two. So we'll just call it players now instead. I have re-downloaded the spreadsheet just again to ensure that the data is the same in both places. So again, I'll ask to update it, but there's no actual changes. So we do want to do the -1 because now we're talking player count instead of opponent count, which I think is much nicer. So again, that's just complaining because the panel's referencing the old data now. So finally, I think, maybe, where are we? We've got our map back, we've got our shields and our speed, and we've also got correctly showing the opponents for that particular map. So we'll just switch it back to our lower. So we get 2 shields, 2 spacers. Colours are to be defined, but there's 2 players nonetheless. So once we've got our opponent's widget created, we also want to create our menu, and we've actually put that all into the screen switcher now. We haven't coded it. We still need to copy the logic for switching screens over there and tie everything up, so there's still a bit of work to do there, but we want to create our screen switcher. It's not particularly a good name for it, I think. I may rename that. Screen switcher. I thought I put, there we go. I'm going to call it container. Maybe a little bit nicer. I have to think of a better name for it moving forwards, but that'll do. So we'll create our screen container. Now our screen container needs a few things. We know that we need the sector, really, I guess, is above all else. That's what we need. And we need the island name. Do we need anything else about the island? We don't need... No, we don't need the biome. We don't need anything else, as far as I can tell. So we could expose the island name or modify the island name directly, and the sector epoch directly, sector epoch directly, but we don't really want to do that. What we do want is to receive the sector, but this is actually going to be our sector controller, not our sector structure. Oh, why is our sector controller round? Default value, I guess, that makes sense. So if we just select something else, screen container. So we've got our sector there. Now our sectors array. This sectors array is all the raw data. we actually only really want to use that for our minimap, which we've created once and only ever will create once. But we do want to do it for our start location as well temporarily. So from that point on, we actually only want to use the sector controllers. We want to get a copy at the index of our sector index. Now that because of the sector index is probably going to be our location, not our actual yeah, so let's see what that's, yeah, because it's highlight sector, and highlight sector is going to give us our location, not our kind of index offset. Where do we deal with that then? I think anyway. Oh no, we do. It's an index because we get the images, and then from the images we just make the marker right. I think that's okay. We do want later on some more interaction with how the sector works, so we want to be able to select the different sectors and interact with them differently rather than just the simple selection of sector. In this case there's right click and there's left click, and the context of the left click really is like you can deploy armies and stuff directly through the minimap, but that shouldn't actually affect other parts. And it also means that the minimap really needs the sector controllers so that it can access whether there's castles or armies on the individual sectors. But again, got to leave some parts of it, try and do it incrementally. At the moment we're just going to pass that sector straight through into our screen container. We need the island name as well, didn't we? Don't think we actually care anything more about it than the display name, so we're just going to go straight for that. Yeah, we just have to select none. Select that. We do want to put them the other way around. Just because it's cleaner. And that's our display name we want. So now with our screen container, our island name, which is at this level, we can get that, set the text to that, and we can just do that straight away. Again, our pre-constructor, actually, the more kind of logic we put at the game level, the less useful our pre-construct is, because there's just nothing to show. That's not so cool. That's a different issue. I mean, obviously, it's really obvious why that happens. Okay, so in our layout, we've just got the map container. In the map container, we put our map and we put our opponents. But there's a named slot which we can put down just because it fills in the gap a bit. I'll call that one the map. It's not even opponents anymore now, is it? Maybe just players. So within the game now, rather than adding to the horizontal bar, so we add our layout, we create our map, map container. Let's find out what that. So we actually, the map container doesn't want to be a variable anymore. It's just a horizontal box. And so the layout, get the map. Can we do with that? Set content. Create map widget. Content. Do it like before. See if that works first. Don't care about that. Okay, map's back. So on to players. Get players. Not quite. Do occasionally forget to tie things up. Okay, so that populates everything, and now we don't duplicate our players, as we've called it now. Again, I'm gonna go into the UI. Rather than opponents, it's so it's got the game speed in there as well, so it's not particularly ideal. I think the game speed perhaps even needs to be its own view entirely. Player list. That'll be a good enough name for that. Okay, so fix that. So now we create our screen container widget. And again, what we don't want to do is just dump that into our vertical layout, because we're just going to end up with the same problem with our just do replace with vertical box, just to get rid of their name. So that will be screens. So again, from the layout widget, so might be worth having that layout widget as a variable, but for now, let's see if that works. I don't care about the panel. Excellent. So we kind of got all the pieces back again, but they're tied up differently now. So at the moment, there's no real distinction from one sector to another. What we can do though is random int in range. We'll say minimum of 1, maximum of 100. So now all our sectors have different people, and we can go into our what we were doing there was setting the sector epoch, get set text. So I guess our sector structure it doesn't have an epoch. Maybe that's okay. So I won't set that just yet, because we don't actually know what it is. The screen container, our population here on our root menu, is actually coming from our player controller. Yeah, so we have the sector that this screen container's tied to here. That's our sector controller, and it's got its data that we can split and see all the bits and pieces. So there's various things that are useful for our resources, the initial resources for that particular sector, the locations of the images for the castle, etc. Maybe we'll look at utilizing that and the castle image tomorrow, or whenever the next stream is, which should be tomorrow, but I think that would be a good alternative. But we need to propagate that down to the individual menus, and basically have the menus run and connect to the sector controller instead of the player controller. And not quite sure how best to do that, whether it's best to just pass it through, but it kind of has to go through. The advantage with the player controller was that it's always there. It's something we can get to quite quickly, but because we don't want to tie everything to the player, we could have tied the sectors that the player owns to the player perhaps, but the another problem with that is that the sectors exist even if a player doesn't own them, and an army can exist on that sector, an army can be building their castle on that sector, so the sector really just, it doesn't help that it belongs to a player. The player is only interacting with the UI anyway, but we do need to figure out how to update that individual number there our unallocated population number with the value in our sector controller. Because the root menu doesn't really have depth, does it? Because we've made it so that it does. It has the resources. That's the only depth it has. Because everything else is going to be controlled by itself. So we'll call it the still called root menu in this context. So the root screen needs, so it's got an access to the player controller, and obviously we're using that all over the place, so we're not just going to delete that, but we are going to give a sector controller. Now what we could do is create the root screen when we create the screen container, and just dynamically add all of these things rather than have them on the screen at the time. But there's a benefit to having them all on the screen so that we can kind of make sure that they are kind of all consistently aligned and things like that. But that shouldn't make any difference. If we were to construct it, we would set the player controller on it when we construct it, but we can get the root screen, the sector controller, and we can just set the sector controller on it directly. So we'd kind of do that after we set the text for the island, for the epoch. And I keep the island text the same for the time being. So I'll just run it through there just so we know that that exists. And the sector controller will just be him. Now, in theory, the sector controller could just be exposed to the screen controller's level, and then the screen controller could ensure that each of the different screens have the data they need from the screen controller, tie up their particular events. But there's so many events, I think, for an individual screen, that putting all the handling of that inside this one view would be just messier than passing the sector controller down. But now we have the sector controller. It's really not really worth doing it in the pre-construct anymore, because nothing's going to show up, is it? Again, the downside of relying on basically game level data. So what do? Change screen events, it's fine. So we haven't tied up that, but we can tie that up even enough. So the event tick gets the unallocated population text box and sets it to the player's controller's unallocated population count. Effectively, we want to do exactly the same thing, but now we're using the sector controller. At the moment, we're just calling it population. We are probably going to have to rename it unallocated population, and we convert that to text. So I think it starts at 100 when it's created, and then it flicks to the appropriate value. we'll do this actually in the primary constructor, just see if that's a little bit cleaner. So we're getting some errors. Because it's saying that our sector controller should be an object reference, a blue circle, yep. What's gone wrong over here? Oh, screen container. I think we just had the values messed up a bit there. Still not working. Container widget. Yes, we need to do is valid. Don't know what the difference is between the two, so just drop them both down. Okay, so one's just a function that returns a Boolean value, and one gives us a branch, effectively. Branch seems like a nice idea. I mean, we really want to do that kind of straight away. So push all that over. Say, if we're able to get a valid sector controller for whatever index we've been given, carry on. Otherwise, let's print an error. Put that in the wrong place. See if that gives us that error. Yeah, so sector 6. Sector 6 should be that one. And sector 10. So yeah, we're returning the location here, not the index. Yeah, so it's awkwardly inconsistent. Yeah, it was looking up. The location is the ID of the array of images within this context. Now the map itself doesn't really know what location each item is. I don't think there's necessarily any reason for it to. It might need to be changed when it knows the when we start rendering castles and armies onto the map. But for now, what we'll do is we know that each of the sectors here has a location in it. So rather than just getting by index, we can find so I want to create a macro for this because I think the normal find is a macro, or at least the for loops are macros. Is valid is a macro. It's kind of neat. We've got this for each here, which is a macro. So I think this find that we're going to put down in this case should be 2. Find sector by location, and the input is going to be a location integer, single value, and the output is going to be the sector controller. And sector controller, and the next input, because we're going to do something like the for each. If we just find the right graph, the for each takes an array and what to find. So I think the arguments of our macro should actually be our sectors, or sector controllers. Save that. And in our event graph we can now use this find. Obviously we haven't implemented it yet, but what we do is we pass in our sectors and in our location. Awkward on our green line there, so just make sure that's rooted so it doesn't cross over this one. Input object, that's T is valid, so put that there, pass the sector controller in there. So I think it's going to need execution, but we'll only get that once we've put something in here, I think. What we need to do then is, so I've never made a macro before, but we can look at this one and we can see, okay, so it's actually got an argument for execution and outputs of execution as well, so that's definitely how we tie up our macro here. So we need another argument. Again, we'll just call it what they've called it, and we'll call it execution. And the output needs execution again. Can't have the same. What did the macro call it then? Is valid, is not valid. So we'll call this completed. I'll type that up there. So we branch. If the array element get data, split that. So we're basically just going to compare that location with that location. if that's true, then we want to break our array, break our iteration even. So we just wrap that down there so it's clear. If it's not, we'll just keep going. I think then we can pass that to that. Obviously if we complete and we don't break the array element, I'm not actually convinced that will work. I think because we've finished the event loop, the array element should still be invalid. Yeah, so I think we're still showing the last one. So what I'll do is I'll what was the for each loop do it then? Huh. Let's copy this. Local integer. Local wildcard. Assign. Variable value. Okay. I don't like it being a wild card, but local doesn't look like looks like these things only exist for certain things, but the wild card works. We just have to cast it when we're done, which isn't great. It's not that bad either. We're not going to be doing it a lot. Cast to sector controller. And we've completed. Strange. Doesn't look like it ties up correctly, but let's give it a go. No. It's a little frustrating. We have the index, don't we? Let's do it that way then. Local index. Local integer. Variable value. Delete that. And now once we're done, might as well put done down here. We want to get from the array that index value and throw it out. That should mean that we've got the right one. Still that jutter, and there's no way, unless we have created the same random value for each of the sectors. I don't think we have. Flux actor controller. Oops. Doesn't look like our object has anything, which is annoying because we can give it inputs. It'll take a few minutes for this to load now. Unfortunately, I have not got a valid license for it, so it just goes straight away. I'd have thought that an object would have had the constructor, just like anything else. Event construct. But it really doesn't. That makes the base object class fairly useless. Let's just work with it. Let's get it done. I don't want that one actually. All we want to know is whether our population was different for each of our constructor classes. Yes. So the question is, why are we only ever seeing 50? That must mean the macro is not working still. So let's try resetting our local variable. We want that one. Oh, just had to compile it to 0 first before we run everything else. Nope. Does not print anything in that case. So we set our local variable to 0, much like the for loop does. Kind of looking at this one mostly, the array index. Can't see really why my little macro is not doing what I'd expect. The only downside is that if it gets to the end, yeah, I think that's the thing, isn't it? We're incrementing the local variable all the time. I think we only want to do it when we found a match. Still no luck. Missing that one. Okay, let's find out what that index is when we finish. Oh, there's also the fact that we weren't calling it. That's going to be a big thing. Okay, that's probably what it was. Might have been right earlier, for that matter, but it's not a big issue. We don't want the array index at all. We just wanted to call it. No, that's what we're missing. Weren't calling it. Done that too many times. Forgot to. I added the white execute path, and I forgot to tie them up after I did that. So now it works correctly. So we can go into the sector controller, destroy that. So what we've achieved then is some element of separation for the sectors and their data. The opponent's list is now tied correctly to the amount of players of the map. The minimap kind of more affects the bottom menu. The next step would be to tie up events for the slab, as it's called. so that updates again based on the minimap, because that hasn't worked for a while, even though that I know that underlining code will. So that's something to do next. For now though, because clearly I'm making silly mistakes, I'm gonna stop now. I think we've kind of changed things around a bit. Didn't really actually add any new functionality, maybe a little bit, but wasn't significant updates. But it's really just setting us up for like the proper gameplay elements, where the sector controller now is going to own all that data, and we can start tying up the screens better moving forward. So a few more things to basically handle when the change of screen works. One good thing is that it is evident that we are re-rendering all of this information. We are replacing that widget each time. I think we can certainly prove that by, I don't know if there's a, yeah, so there's a deconstruction event. It shouldn't really say hello, but it does. So we can see that widget is entirely destroyed, entirely re-rendered, and there's not any kind of flickery effect here. It kind of re-renders quite well. It's not perfect because the number doesn't change correctly, does it? There's some delay there. It's kind of what we were seeing before, where it changed from one number to another. Root screen, probably because it defaults to 0, and that just, I think that just kind of gets in the way. Let's see what that looks like now. Yeah, so the number flickers to 0 and then back again. So we can fix that. By just changing the order in which things happen. Where's our screen container? And we need our game, I think it was. So it creates the map widget, it creates the player list, then it contains the screen container. And then we set the content, so the player controller is already set. Oh, but it's in the tick, isn't it? See if that helps. That's even worse. I have to look into that. I think, so far as I can tell, the order is correct. When it's constructed, it sets the text, but maybe it can't set the text. Oh no, it must be able to set the text. And that's what it should do straight away, and it should be able to get the sector controller because that's passed into the constructor of the class. Yeah, it clearly renders it with no value. Interestingly enough, clicking the same place doesn't cause an event. It's probably because the selector's getting in the way, actually. But yeah, so I'm not sure why we got that flicker. It'd be good to get rid of it. The value should be set before it renders it, really. We do have a game error though. root screen, aren't we? Yes, sorry, I know why now. The sector controller is set after the fact. In the screen container. Yeah, okay, I remember now. Because we don't create the root screen here. Yeah, okay, so I think that would be solved by dynamically creating the screens. We could probably do that in the pre-construct so that they were rendered again in the preview, instead of doing that. That would work. Probably actually not going to be cleaner to do it as a loop. Switcher. Worried there that it wouldn't give me an option to be able to add a child to the switcher. So we don't need to do that anymore. So just because there's multiple routes, we'll actually we'll delete the route from here. It's not great because the route needs to go inside that horizontal box, inside that vertical box, doesn't it? So that should stop the flicker. There we go. All of that All of that changed just to stop that number going from a half a second of black. Go back to this controller and get rid of that text output. I know, it was the deconstructor of the root screen that we didn't want. Yeah, so I'd say quite a bit of tedious change, but and a lot of fixing up. Now we do the root container that way. We should really do all of them that way, just for consistency. But the benefit is that we do get to see still the root and the resource all in place. We just may not see it here. So we just take all those out and put them all back in dynamically. But we can deal with that. So I need to put those two things back in. The switching will be easy because that's basically the same code from the previous panel that we had, and obviously adding the widgets is easy too. Yeah, so that gives us kind of our base to work from for tomorrow, or as say the next stream should be tomorrow. Getting there with kind of having that centralized, well, less centralized perhaps, because it was centralized all being on the player controller, but the more I did that, the more I was like, well, I know it's not going to work this way, so I don't want to keep adding functionality in the player controller, because most of it's going to kind of functionally be the same in the sector controller, but different enough that it probably isn't going to just be as simple as copy and paste. So that's all for tonight, for the second time, but definitely that's all for tonight. Thanks for watching, hope to see you again. Good night for now.